Hey everybody, it's Swank Ivy again, bringing you another Letters to an Asexual. This is number 16. I got this request on Tumblr. The letter reads, I wanted to ask about coming out as asexual. I'm a minor and live with my family if that helps. Thanks. I get this kind of question fairly often, so I figured I would just make this one into a how to come out as asexual video. First, I should mention that coming out is not always necessary. Before you come out, you should think about whether coming out will have any benefits for you and whether it has the power to transform anything about your life. Of course, it feels super great to be able to be honest with your friends and family about who you are and really get them to understand you. And of course, it also allows you to help with visibility efforts because then those people know more about asexuality and the whole community benefits. But if there's any reason that you feel unsafe about it, don't feel obligated to come out. Also, think about who you're coming out to. You have no obligation to come out to people that you might feel uncomfortable with being out to. Think about whether you would disclose information about your sexual orientation to that person if it turned out you were gay or if you were straight. If you wouldn't share these details in those cases, then there's no reason that you have to disclose to that level about asexuality. Now, assuming that you have decided to come out, the idea here is to set things up ahead of time so that you'll get the best possible reaction. Of course, if you're planning to come out to someone who historically has been totally non-judgmental, you don't have to worry too much about building up a whole plan and everything, but sometimes a little bit of preparation can go a long way in making sure your coming out experience is the best it can be for you and for them. If you're nervous about how the person might act because you strongly suspect it won't be a positive reaction, here are some guidelines for you. First off, you should be knowledgeable. Get in your head the definition of asexuality that best applies to you, and figure out the wording for how you want to say it. It's very likely that most people that you come out to will have no idea what asexuality is, so getting into coming out to them often requires a 30 to 40 minute education session, and depending on your willingness to participate in that, you may just want to be prepared for something like this to happen. You might want to consider personally setting down some boundaries for the types of questions you're willing to answer. Sometimes you do get some very intensely personal questions from people you would totally not expect them to ask, and you're not obligated to answer those. So if you remember that you don't have to go into details that you're uncomfortable with if you want to be able to come out, then sometimes it's easier to stick to those if you've predefined what you're willing to talk about and to what extent. You might consider looking into the best wording for what your romantic orientation is, and also maybe look through some documents or some videos detailing some of the most common responses to asexuality so you can figure out how you're going to answer those. You may even consider that in particular cases of people you're coming out to, you know them better than I could know them from just talking about it in an informal video, so you can consider tailoring your responses to the types of reactions that a particular person in your life that you're going to come out to might be likely to have. If you can anticipate what kinds of reactions each person might have, then sometimes you can figure out what would answer those objections, what kind of resource you might have available at your fingertips. People tend to fall into certain categories of objections, and I'm going to go over those real quick. One of the most common responses is the scientific type. These are the ones that sound like, oh, that's not possible because nobody's scientifically proven that, or that can't happen because if asexuality existed, that would violate the biological imperative to reproduce, or they may even bring out ideas about how it's a mental disorder and that there are mental disorders listed that talk about sexual aversion or sexual arousal disorders. The best way to counter these people, of course, is to be ready with evidence that they are wrong. Sometimes you can bring out, say, the scientific study that said, hey, we're about 1% of the population. This study says so. and then that's countered. You can deal with the one where they say that it's a biological imperative by discussing how it's actually been examined in plenty of scientific literature and doctoral dissertations and sociological perspectives. Plenty of published papers exist on this topic that they're surely just ignorant of. And you can have a couple of these ready at your fingertips in, actually holding the documents, or if you're having the conversation through email or through electronic communication, have a link ready. For the people who pull up the mental disorders, you can say actually in the most recently released version of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, version 5, actually calls out an exception for asexuality in 2 separate instances, saying that if a person identifies as asexual, they can't be diagnosed as having sexual aversion disorder or hypoactive sexual desire disorder or something like that. So, knowing what they might be likely to say and having ready a response to it tends to teach them that maybe they need to do a little more research before invalidating you. Another category of people who will invalidate you are the people who have never heard of asexuality before, and they think that the fact that they've never heard of it before means it can't exist. They think you're making it up and that you're the only person who feels this way. And they're actually very easy to counter. All you have to do is talk about the asexual community, or bring up an interview, or pull up a documentary reference. When people start realizing that actually we've been in the media, we've been talking to all kinds of outlets in the media over a period of many years, over a decade now as I'm making this video. Sometimes they will realize, oh, this has been under my nose for a while and I didn't know it was there. So maybe I'm the one who needs to listen and learn rather than immediately try to shoot you down. So that can sometimes work if you figure that the person that you're talking to is very likely to just say, oh, I've never heard of it, so it doesn't exist. And another category, which is probably one of the best ones to get, is the non-judgmental curious party. These are the people who may not give you a hard time about you being asexual, but they're going to have a lot of questions, and sometimes their curiosity can be really exhausting and time-consuming for you to deal with. So if you have a suspicion that the person that you're going to bring this up to is going to have all kinds of enthusiastic questions for you, you may come prepared with, say, a link to the Allies section of AVEN, or you may say, oh, here's an overview of asexuality, here's Swankivy's video, or I've written a series of Ally articles for Good Vibrations, and maybe you could send them a link to that so that they can understand how to be a good ally to people in the asexual community. All of those can really help cut down on the amount of time and energy you have to put into answering their questions. Now, moving away from what to expect, here are some specific strategies to start this conversation. Sometimes it's best not to plan a sit-down, deliberate coming out with the people that you want to come out to. Sometimes you can just wait until it comes up naturally in a conversation and maybe respond to something that erases or talks down to asexual people by saying, oh, actually, they're asexual people, so that leaves them out, something like that. Sometimes it's just easier to deal with it if it comes up naturally and you don't have to feel like you are really under pressure here. Some other kind of sneaky ways of maybe goading people into maybe asking about it would be, be obnoxious and wear a shirt like this. I don't know if you can see it, but my shirt says, when you say I'm confused about my sexuality, you really mean you're confused about my sexuality. And it's in asexual colors, so a shirt like that will sometimes get a question and give you the opportunity to bring it up. Or perhaps, like I have on my purse, a nice big asexual flag button with an aromantic heart on it. We have our own symbols, so, that's a nice subtle way of having something that someone might ask about. You can't count on this happening, but it does give you a chance to have it come up naturally in conversation, have them start the conversation. And of course, the downside of that is you can't be prepared. You don't know when it might happen. So if you count on that as your way of coming out to people, you may be waiting a long time and you may feel very flustered when it actually does happen when you don't expect it. Another way of not coming out specifically and deliberately, but possibly starting this conversation, would be to maybe link to or post something on your Facebook, your Tumblr, your blog, recycle an article and talk about it being interesting, or just post it uncommented and see what people say. You can also bring up asexuality in conversation without saying that you personally identify that way, and that's one way of maybe testing the waters with certain people. You can determine whether this is appropriate for any of the interactions you'd like to have, and it does help to maybe test out what people might say without them saying it to you, and figure out whether you're going to be coming out in a safe environment. And if you suspect that you aren't because of these experiences, you'll be better prepared for your coming out if you do decide to face that. If you do decide to opt for a sit-down coming out, and you suspect that maybe the person might get really confrontational or hostile about it, based on your previous interactions with the person or your knowledge of their personality, you might consider telling them, okay, we're going to sit down, I'm going to tell you something, and I really want you to just let me say my whole piece without interrupting. And that way you have a little less pressure that they're not going to jump in and jump down your throat and start asking you questions or start making demands. So this also serves to make you look a little bit more like an authority, like you have everything under control. And when you say everything nice and planned out, figure out what you're going to say, try to keep it brief so you don't start rambling like me. And at the end of it, ask them, do you have any questions? This sort of sets a tone for they're asking you, you're allowing their input. And a lot of times it stops the more aggressive people from tramping all over you when you're trying to share something about yourself with them. You also might consider trying to come out to acquaintances or people that you don't know very well, or perhaps do it online with people who are not maybe a high-stakes person like a partner or your parent. That way, you can get used to saying the words. You can get used to hearing the responses. You can kind of take a test run or two so that you can get used to this experience, because it's a little unpredictable sometimes if you've never done it before, if you've never spoken these things out loud. And a lot of people underestimate how difficult it might be to actually start to say it out loud. So if you do a test run with somebody whose reaction is not going to affect your life as much, you may have a better experience when you come out to these people who are possibly going to be people you have long-term relationships with. And here's a note for those of you who are in your teens or possibly even early 20s. You might want to resign yourself right now to the fact that if you come out to certain older people, some of them are going to say, you'll grow out of it, or something dismissive to that effect. And I'm afraid there's not really much you can say to a person who says that, because these are people who are dismissing and invalidating what you're trying to share with them. And they want to be there at the end of whatever phase they think this is to say, I told you so. And I told you so has no place in this conversation. So there's really nothing that a young person can say to an older person who's dismissing everything they say as immaturity in order to get them to accept that this isn't just a symptom of immaturity. Yes, it's possible that you might be sexually fluid, or you may choose a different label later in your life, but there's really no purpose for an adult to say this to a younger person. And I guess the best response to a person who says that to you might be something like, oh, okay, I get it. Well, I guess there was no purpose in me sharing this with you if you're just going to tell me I'm immature, so we don't need to have this conversation. Everyone changes as they age, and it doesn't mean that you don't deserve respect right now. Sometimes the thing that will get an older person off your back is if you use the phrase right now in some of your conversations. Obviously, right now sounds like you're agreeing with them that only right now you haven't found anybody, but maybe later in your life you will. It sounds a little bit like a concession, but what they seem to react really poorly to is you saying that this is a permanent orientation or any kind of statement of knowledge about your future that they think you can't have right now because of your limited perspective as a young person, which is, it's really dismissive. It's not accurate, but the best thing to do is play along and say, well, I've never found anybody who I feel that way about, so right now I'm happy calling myself asexual. And they just seem to react so much less poorly to that if they think that you're not making some kind of vow or promise to never be interested in someone that way. And that tends to get them to leave you alone, at least until you're a little older. And unfortunately, they can start to take you more seriously when you get a little older. But one of the sad facts of being asexual is, here I am, age 35, I'm old enough to be president, and people are still telling me I'll grow out of it and that I'll mature and be more like them. But it's not about you, it's not about your maturity, it's about their inability to understand what an adult actually is and what defines maturity. So really the best thing you can do is figure out how to tolerate that misunderstanding, because it's very hard to counter it. So during any conversation about asexuality, one thing you might want to keep in the back of your head while you're talking about it is try to throw in frequent references to the asexual community. What this does is it subtly reinforces the idea that, hey, it's not just you. There's actually a whole group of people who are talking about this. They don't necessarily know how big it is, but when you frequently bring up the fact that there's consensus, there's culture, there's conversation, there's all this stuff that they didn't know was going on, sometimes they'll start to realize, hey, this is maybe something I should have been less ignorant about. Maybe I should have known this was going on, and they'll be subtly encouraged to understand that there's a whole group of people out there that they've never paid any mind to. Let's see what else. If they start spouting some of the more common misconceptions, one really good way to introduce your debunking of it is to say, oh, a lot of people have that misconception, or, oh yeah, that's a really common misunderstanding. Sometimes when you set off your response with something like that, they start to realize that they're not original, they're not coming up with some kind of new thought that you've never considered before with regards to your own orientation. So sometimes that, again, subtly reinforces the idea that, oh, maybe I should be doing a little more listening than talking. And also, unless they're a huge jerk, they generally don't want to be thought of as part of a group of ignorant clowns who have continually said the same things to this minority group. So that sometimes does encourage them to listen to you and to stop calling out possible reasons why what you've just said about yourself isn't true. Here's another hint. Ask questions periodically like, do you understand that? Or do you have a question about that? It starts to create sort of a tone where you're the teacher, they're the student, and puts you kind of in the authority. Unfortunately, a lot of conversations that are about asexuality put the asexual person on the defensive. They always feel like they have to defend the orientation because they're being buried under this onslaught of questions, and you feel like you have to defend it. But you're the authority here. You're the one who knows what's going on. So if you try to keep that authoritative tone and control the conversation through giving them little pockets to speak, like a teacher, then you really have the best chance to just own it. And finally, if you're nervous about doing it in person, you can always consider writing a letter. You can send the letter through email, or you can print out a copy, write it by hand. And this method of telling someone also has the added benefit of being able to include whichever of the most appropriate resources that you decided would back up what you were saying. You can print that out and attach it, or put in a link or an attachment on your email. If you're not ready to come out, that's okay. You don't have to feel like you're letting the community down or like you're a bad person if you can't do it right now or you can't do it ever. Some people just don't live in a safe environment or aren't personally comfortable with being out. And everybody who wants to be able to publicly identify as asexual shouldn't have to be an activist on top of it. Also, if you're getting pressured or questioned about what you're not doing, and you don't want to imply that you're straight, but you don't want to come out either, there's a line that works really well, which goes something like, I've just never met anybody I'm interested in that way, and I'm fine with that for now. That way you're not calling out a specific orientation or inviting questions, really, but you're telling people to just pause and leave you alone. It always seems like the questions start getting asked and the microscope comes out on you if you suggest that this is a lifelong phenomenon, because people will immediately say, oh, you can't know that, and you have to do this, and start putting all kinds of expectations and obligations on you for when you're allowed to say that you actually do feel that way. But this seems to be a line that has worked well in telling people that it's not really their business without also lying. There have been people who are in situations where they have felt more comfortable and maybe safer in a certain environment if they do lie. And I'm not going to say that you should lie, but I should also say that if you have to lie to feel safe, you should lie. So in extreme situations, sometimes it's better to just claim that you have a significant other or wear a ring and let people come to their own conclusions. These are not ideal situations, but sometimes they can be necessary for certain people's mental and physical health. So, you should not feel like you're a bad activist or a bad person or you let anybody down. If you end up feeling like you have to, for your safety, do something like this, or you feel more comfortable doing that. But overall, saying something vague like the line that I've suggested does work for most people if they're not ready to come out yet or come out at all. I hope this video has been helpful in starting and finishing some of those conversations. Feel free to leave your questions in my comments, and my video info box should have some resources for you in connecting the people that you come out to the information that they may need. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.